Hello, BookTube. I'm back, or we're back here
Hmm.
with I'm with Scott Danielson, and
Hello,
we're to
everybody.
discuss some more essays
Yes.
from SF in Dimension by Alexei and Cory Panshin. And
Hmm.
this from the second edition, revised and enlarged. I don't think he did much change to the uh, initial essays. It was just he added some others at
Hmm.
the beginning.
Yeah.
Originally published, and I can't remember. Originally published 1976, and the second edition 1980 by
Mm.
Advent publishers.
Very good. And this
And I want
section's called SF in the 70s,
yes,
and
and
it's
I
not very long, but yeah,
no,
please. Hmm.
but I want to read the first paragraph as like we've been reading little bits of it in
Hmm.
previous ones. This is called Fragmentation, and it's from Fantasy and Science Fiction magazine, June 1973. And he starts out with the paragraph or the essay. These are desperately fragmented times. The presidential campaign just passed was most notably lacking in leadership. The winning candidate won by being less visible than the losing candidate. If a few years ago Dylan and the Beatles were the two clear leaders of popular music, today there are no leaders but only factions. More than ever previously, the way to succeed in rock music is through decadence and contempt. We may yet see Alice Cooper and David Bowie surpassed by the ultimate in decadence and contempt. Three young men with short hair dressed in Kingston Trio candy striped shirts. And this is 1973. So,
Oh my goodness. That is so crazy to read that.
yeah,
Yeah. And then he says the fragmentation cuts all through our society. It
yeah.
affects science fiction too. Yeah. And that's definitely what it looks like today. I mean, I could write that today.
Yeah, just about science fiction, nothing else.
Right. Wild, wild. Yeah, incredible stuff. It's amazing, the cyclical history.
Yeah, because it's at the time too, Vietnam and everything too. So
Yeah.
that's where he, in the previous ones he was talking about, the times and stuff like this,
Hmm.
of war, and it's like occasionally, yeah, it's cyclical. It's things that just sort of resonate at other times.
Hmm.
And I was thinking too about the fact of because I was talking to somebody about Sherlock Holmes, and Dr. Watson was coming back from the Afghan wars, and when they made the new Sherlock Holmes with Benedict Cumberbatch, they had Dr. Watson coming back from Afghanistan.
Right, right.
So
Yeah.
it just it's cyclical. Like it's nothing compare. It's not
Yeah, yeah.
this, but it's just sometimes things just fit in nicely.
Yep. Oh, what is it about us humans?
So I'm trying to remember fully what he talked about in this essay. Do you remember this one
Well,
more than I
yeah. I
do?
mean, he's just talking about again. I mean, he sets it up just great. Where he's just talking about how we're in a period of science fiction where there is no leader, right?
Yeah,
Instead, there are factions of I don't know, groups, I guess, people writing similar things in little groups rather than somebody, some one thing blazing the trail through it.
yeah, and
So
it's basically reviews. Yeah,
yeah,
I
and then he
started
goes
reading that.
into
Yeah,
these reviews, right?
which is
Um,
interesting. I don't have the Astounding Analog Reader Volume One, edited
yeah.
by Harry Harrison and Brian W. Aldis. It
Mm-hmm.
says collection of 15 stories published in Astounding between 37 and 46. And his
Yeah.
main criticism, which is interesting, is that they edited it and chose it from nostalgia, where it should have been done from a historical perspective with commentary of
Mm-hmm.
talking about the stories in that way, because they just sort of reprinted a bunch of stories that are everywhere. And as it is kind of interesting to see the personal commentary, but it's not. Yeah, I think I agree with him that something like that should have been done from an historical perspective.
Yeah, yeah. It's I'm not, so the stories we're talking about, like you said, 1937 through 1946. I guess that's far enough to have some kind of historical um, perspective. But yeah, I mean, if I was putting something together from, let's say, the 80s, where I grew up, it'd be hard not to pick the stories that impacted me.
Yeah.
I'm sure that my collection would be different from another person's collection. But if he also talks about some things being picked that are in a lot of different anthologies, and why didn't they go with something a little less common? But it depends on what Joseph. Hello. It depends on what the purpose is.
Yeah,
Are you
exactly.
picking
Yes.
my favorite stories, or if you're picking historical stories? But if you're picking historical stories, you're going to pick the ones that have been anthologized over and over, right? Because those
Yeah.
are the ones that have had the most impact.
But he also wants like he thought it should reflect what is happening in science fiction now. So maybe looking at stuff saying, "Oh, look at what they did here," which is
And
what
that
science
led to
fiction is
here.
doing now.
Yeah.
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 So maybe that would be less
Oops.
popular ones as well.
Could
Uh,
be. Yeah.
and
Could
and
be.
and and I think of when I was writing this. Yeah, I wrote this. When I was reading this, I was thinking of Isaac Asimov's collections of short stories of his own when he collects them. He a lot of times has autobiographical memoir material, linking these about what was
Yeah.
going on, which that works because
Yeah.
that's
I
him.
really like
That's
that.
him.
And I
That's
also
him.
like the anthologies. There's one, I think it was Asimov and Greenberg edited one. I think it was called My Favorite Science Fiction Story, where authors
Oh
pick
yeah, yeah,
the ones that they liked. And then again, I'm not positive of my memories right here, but there was a collection of authors picking their favorites from the past, and then there was an author picking the favorite story that they wrote. They said, "This is the story that I wrote that I like the best."
yeah,
So there's anthologies like that too.
yeah. And
I
then
have another thing that I really like is I have it's a fantasy and science fiction 25th anniversary anthology, and in it, an author introduces every story, but it's not the author of the story. So, Fritz Leiber may write about Arthur C. Clarke or something like that, and I'm just giving an example. I can't remember if that's
yeah,
exactly what's in
yeah,
there, but write a little essay, a page or two, and clearly the authors in that collection were picked, for those stories because those stories meant something to them.
yeah,
I like
yes,
that kind of stuff too. Yeah.
yeah. And I also have one that I want off the top of my head say it was Sam Moskowitz that edited it, but it may not be. It's where he's with the editor went to editors and said, "Give me a story that you think was the best that's been published in your magazine." So it
Mm,
was editors. I think it was just called Editor's Choice.
yeah,
I
that's
can't
pretty cool.
remember who the editor was for
Yeah,
sure.
and it's really interesting when the story that's picked is not something common.
Yeah,
You know, I remember Frederick Pohl saying, "Gosh, I'm not going to remember the name of the story," but he said he wrote a story that he thought was a potential award winner, right? And it showed up on none of the lists.
yeah,
I can't remember which one that was. Was it Day Million
yeah.
or something like that? I don't
Honestly, I
remember.
can't
That
remember.
doesn't
I
sound
can't
right.
remember.
But it was a story that it has been anthologized a few times, but somehow didn't make it on people's lists. And then Harlan Ellison, um, there's a collection he has. It's actually an audio collection, and it's Voice from the Edge. And um, there's a story that he wrote called Grail, Grail, and in his introduction he said, I thought this would be huge. He said this is a story that I thought would have been really big, and it wasn't. So yeah, authors don't always know.
Well, it's like there's a good story with Isaac Asimov going to a lecture somewhere, and I think it was the person was talking, or the lecturer was talking about Nightfall, and he was saying this and this and this and this about it. I can't remember exactly what he was saying, but he was saying it was praising it. And then Asimov went up at the end and said, "No, I think you've misunderstood what the story is about."
Hmm.
And so he explains it, and he goes, "Well, no, that's not what it is." And he goes, "Well, I should know. I wrote it." And he goes, "Yeah, you wrote it, so you don't know what it's about." Like basically, that was the gist of the conversation.
Yes, yeah, and that's an interesting concept in itself, isn't it? Because yeah, the reader's part of this whole thing.
Yeah,
Clearly, without the reader, the story, is just a paperweight or whatever.
yeah,
But yeah, authors are constantly surprised at what people pull out of there. Because everybody's bringing themselves to it, right?
yeah. And the
And
thing with his with Alexei Panshin's and Corey, I think the thing is that we can't. It's always both of them because he
mhm.
does talk about we all the time.
Yeah,
So
he
it's
does.
always Alexei and Corey
Mhm.
Panshin. They're like joined at the hip,
Yeah.
in writing and everything. Uh, Now, I agree like that a an anthology like this called Astounding Reader Volume 1, 37 to 46 should be sort of historical. However, if it's not, is that the fault of the book or is that the fault of me? It's sort of like, is this the fault of them by choosing it this way because
Mm.
they decided to do it on a nostalgic way? So is that a really a legitimate criticism to say? You can
No,
say,
I
well,
mean,
I prefer
I
it was
think I
this.
think what it means is that the historical. It's interesting, Sometimes people write reviews based on what they think the book ought to be, and this is
Exactly.
one of them.
Yeah.
But it's like that's not what the book is. So why are you talking about what you wanted, right? It's
Yeah.
like I wanted this and this was that, and therefore I don't like it.
Yeah.
But this is the book that was written. So, but what it means is that there's a hole still that needs to be filled, and somebody ought to do a historical one, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and
You know,
that's why I wanted to bring that up because like it like I don't think it's a fault of the book. I think it's the fault of the pensions like thinking that like wanting something that's not
yeah,
there.
yeah.
You
They're
know.
using that book to say what we really need
Yeah.
is one of these. It's not that this
And
book
then it
doesn't
says
have worth.
the astounding reader provides an interesting contrast with New Dimensions. The stories in New Dimensions are clearly better written. The level of
Mm-hmm.
writing skill has risen incredibly in the last 30 years. Frustration is not absent by any means in the stories of the early 40s by his
Mm-hmm.
bootstraps, and Nightfall by his bootstraps is
Yeah,
the
Nightfall
warp
by his
time travel.
bootstraps. City
Yeah,
was in it. Yeah,
yeah,
by our friend Simak, and First Contact by Leinster. And it
yeah.
says, these selections might have been more acceptable if the timescale of the book were smaller, but they won't do in a book that offers only 15 stories from a 10-year period. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I don't know what to say about that.
Yeah.
It was just, yeah. Again, I just feel like they were saying what we would have loved is this
Yeah.
type of thing.
Yeah, and he goes on to mention, like I say, the other books, and it's just reviews.
Hmm.
I don't think there was anything. The New Dimensions. It says here, and the IQ Merchant, which was by John Boyd, first novel.
Hmm.
I don't recollect that off the top of my head whether I've read that or not.
Yeah, I don't think I have.
But it was says are unable to deal with the problems they raise or resort to trickery and false solution. Thomas Burnett Swan does present a problem and solve it honestly in Wolf Winter. Again,
Hmm.
I don't know that one,
Yeah.
but the book is no less special. And yeah, he's like the things that he says are sort of correct, but in a wrong way. If that makes
I
any
guess.
sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And New Dimensions 2 is an original anthology,
Exactly.
right?
Yes.
So it's a completely different thing.
Yeah.
But I love he throws these sentences in here. An even better comparison might be drawn between these New Dimension stories and the bomb-haunted short stories that choked astounding in the late 40s. That's an interesting thing, because I've noticed that over time too. He's talking about factions, but still, I just remember in the early '90s, I had enough of the multiple universes. It's like every story seemed to be about multiple universes and other me's and in other places. You just read them over and over and over. So there are these zeitgeist things that authors pick up and write about. And at the same time, I think I've said this before, I love the conversation between them,
Yeah.
But it does, there's a point at which you've had enough of that, of the same type of thing, right?
Yeah,
So,
well, that's where, like, see, while he's doing all this, he is let's see if I can get it here. He is researching and thinking about writing this.
yes, yeah,
So a lot of this stuff are thought processes, working out ideas,
hmm,
even in the reviews, I think.
yeah,
But he's also re-looking at, especially up until about 1965 or so. He's reading, or they're reading every science fiction from 26 to like 65.
hmm,
So they're starting to see these trends and
yeah,
these grouping of things, and he mentions it in other essays where there were little, groups, and the next essay is about trends
hmm,
in a more wider aspect, but he does touch on these. And at
yeah,
one, and the thing about the conversation is a good quote from James Blish that's coming up in one of the essays as
right,
well, that talks about that.
hmm,
So yeah, so this, and they say right at the beginning in the introduction that this is a thought process going through. So don't crucify them basically, or don't shoot them for contradicting themselves, or going down false alleys of things,
yeah,
because they're learning as well things, and they're working out their thoughts, and so they've just put it all out there, you know
hmm,
and be damned, basically.
right, right. And like we said last time, he's not afraid to put essays in here that he's actually thought past.
Yeah,
He's grown through that idea to others,
yeah,
and he does include these other ones. Yeah.
yeah. They then this next one is Science Fiction: New Trends and Old. It's from
Mm-hmm.
Science Fiction Today and Tomorrow. It's by Reginald Bretner, Harper and Row, 1974. That was, I think, is Reginald Bretner in the 50s did a collection too, and he calls it a symposium, and he just sort of throws out titles or subjects to the authors and say, write me something on this.
Mm-hmm.
And he did it 3 times, I think, and again in 76. He was also a science fiction writer, but not that for fiction, not that well received. I think it's his these 3 collections are the one that he's going to be remembered for,
Mm.
uh,
Yeah.
that he put together. And it's a little bit tenuous at times. I would say, like, he's a bit tenuous. He gets it. Uh, the Panchins get into this thing of talking about something else, usually in psychology or health, and then they use that as the, I guess, the anchor to then compare it to something in science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I think he's a little tenuous, and sometimes he might not be fully accurate describing the psychological aspect, that if a psychologist would look at it and go, well, that's not really true.
Mm. Yeah.
So but if you, and he does say in this, just go along with me. let's
Mm-hmm.
let's explore this as a thought process. And it's basically, he talks about, it's about trends. So he does talk about trends, like you're saying, of stories, but the biggest trend that he goes through is the fact that, well, he starts out with this conscious and the subconscious. that the subconscious can do stuff that the conscious brain can't, and fantasy fit in to do something in science fiction, but they're now becoming one. Like they're coming together. And he doesn't call SF speculative fiction. He doesn't call it science fiction. It's speculative fantasy.
Yeah. Yeah, he's definitely hung up on the idea that science fiction is mostly fantasy.
Yeah,
You
which
know,
I guess in the big term is it's fantasy is just thinking of something that's not there, and science. But the word fantasy now has so much baggage that it's hard to get away from that aspect. Yeah, of
yeah,
it. I think.
yeah. So he says in here that the often declared and long cherished division between science fiction and fantasy is becoming harder and harder to maintain. And then he makes statements like this one a lot, and I'm curious about it. He said, the audience for modern SF has grown ever since Hugo Gernsback founded Amazing Stories in 1926. In a time when the audience for mimetic fiction is becoming steadily smaller, SF is the one literature in the Western world whose audience is steadily growing.
Yeah,
And I meant to do this before, but I was just curious, like, what is the New York Times bestseller list today? I wonder if that's still true.
yeah, because
If I
the
just
reading,
go,
because reading of reading has dropped. Period. But
yeah,
if people do read, it does seem like it is more popular fantasy and science fiction.
okay. So here I've got hardcover fiction. Onyx Storm is number one, and that's fantasy. I think that's a romantasy, I think is the new category. And then there's one called The Nightingale. Two sisters in World War II France, one struggling to survive in the countryside, the other joining the resistance in Paris. That's number two. And then another Rebecca Yarrow, so another romantasy is number three. And then there's one called James by Percival Everett. I've heard of this. A reimagining of the adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And then The Women by Kristen Hanna. A nurse follows her brother to serve during the Vietnam War and returns to a divided America. And then number 6 is Midnight Black, the 14th book in the Gray Man series. So it's like an espionage thing. And then a James Patterson. Bennett goes after someone who's killing police officers. And then The Wedding People, a woman who is down on her luck forms an unexpected bond with a bride at a wedding in Rhode Island. So, I mean, there's a lot of mimetic fiction on this list, is what I'm saying. And just from personal experience, it seems to me that, of the readers that I meet, in day-to-day life, it seems to me that most people are reading mimetic fiction. And it's a subset of those that are science fiction fans. I mean, there's fantasy fans, and I feel like that's a bigger group than even the science fiction fans, So I think that's just personal experience. I have no data, obviously.
And I wonder where he's basing this on, and he doesn't go into those details of what he's basing his views on. And other than the fact that clearly science fiction has grown in more popularity, that
I would say so. And it's part of especially movies. A good fantasy or science fiction movie seems to do pretty well. Marvel, I'm thinking Marvel, these movies make $1 billion, people love them, right? So, in the movies anyway, but there's still a lot of mimetic movies going on and doing very well, and not $1 billion well. Yeah.
And he also talked about in one of the previous essays where science fiction has always funded itself rather than any other. I'm assuming he's talking about grants and things for authors or foundations or magazines, journals. He's basically saying, that the science fiction does it all themselves. They don't need a grant because science fiction fans will go to the conventions and they
will. Yeah.
and they'll pay to go.
So the folks that like it really like
Yeah,
it. I remember
and
when. Do you remember the show Firefly?
yes,
So I recall, they're making the movie Serenity. After the series was over, they got a movie, and there was a big deal being made amongst the blogosphere, which is what it was back then. Lots of blogs and stuff. It was kind of an amazing thing to them that the movie was being made, because they figured that the audience was going to be limited, and that movie was being shown as, here's your core audience. And I'm not going to remember any numbers, but I mean, the movie did good. It wasn't like Marvel in any way. The movie did fine, but they were thinking about making three, and they didn't make the other two, so it didn't do that fine.
yeah,
So I think about with all of the animation technology we have right now, the special effects budget to make something like Ringworld, they could make Ringworld, right? But why haven't they? Probably because that story has a limited audience,
yeah,
right? It's not Marvel. You know what I mean?
yeah, and things like Dune has created like through various things for the book,
Yeah.
so therefore it has a wider
Well, you
audience.
put Timothy Chalamet and Zendaya in it, and
Yeah.
people are going to go see that. You're going to capture an audience.
I never heard of them before, so I'll say if
Oh,
they're in another movie together, I'll probably not go to see it because
yeah.
they're in it. But I'm in the small minority there.
uh, yeah, I like them both. So, but yeah, that seems to have transcended, and I'm really curious what he's going to do with the third movie,
Mm.
because if he's true to Dune Messiah, which it would be great if he was, I don't know how popular a movie it'll be.
Yeah, because it's not popular with book, definitely.
Yeah,
In the
it's
series.
not the material's not as good, but I appreciate what Herbert was doing there, and I like it for that reason.
Yeah. And going back to the new trends thing, he at the beginning of the essay he talks about criticism and things, and it's interesting the list of books that he has here. He mentions that the first sort of true major book of criticism was Damon Knight's In Search of Wonder,
Mm,
which was the first book published by Advent Publishers, started by Earl Kemp, who was um, a fan and
mm-hmm,
a co-created Advent in Chicago. And I think this was 1953 was the first edition of it, and it's since gone into three editions. But then he mentions James Blish's several books, also by Advent, under Athling, I think is he was
Oh,
writing
Paul
under
Paul Athling, yeah.
yeah, and also another one, the final one, posthumously collected was is called the dog that no the tail that wags the god, or the dog that wags the tail, or something like
Okay,
that.
yeah,
It's a strange thing. And then he does mention his own book, Heinlein and Dimension,
mm-hmm,
also by Advent. And
right,
then Sam Moskowitz books. And Sam Moskowitz done so many, like he did collections of a sort of potted biographies of
mm-hmm,
authors, old and new. A lot of them showed up in Amazing, and then
mm-hmm,
finally, added to or revamped into book form. And he also went back and looked at like the Muncie magazines and pulled out a lot of science fiction out of that, and also
mm-hmm,
San Francisco science fiction uh, phenomena that was in the San Francisco Chronicle, I think it was. A writer, Grant, I think that, or I may, oh no, I might be thinking of the publisher of that book, or two volumes. But he's done a lot of stuff. Like Sam Moskowitz obviously was, in at the dawn of
yeah,
the fandom in
the
the
fandom,
30s,
right,
and
yeah,
then he also his book, The Immortal Storm, was published by Advent Publishers as well. Um, and it goes on, and then he mentions um, Elspeth de Camp's science fiction handbook, and Kingsley Amos's New Maps of Hell.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
I was just reading this and go, well, I got that one, I got that one, I got that one, I got. It's
That's
like I didn't
awesome.
read this before,
Mm-hmm.
and somehow I have most of the reference stuff he talks about
I love it.
in the essay so far.
That's great. That's great. Hopefully, some of those will be on our future list. Yeah.
Yeah. And well, I did mention the thing like the science fiction handbook is sort of like a writing of how to write science fiction, and I'd love to start collecting
Mm-hmm.
science fiction writers who have written about how to write science fiction,
Mm.
or editors or agents, possibly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's so many that have done. I just sort of
Yeah. For
started looking
sure.
around and go, oh, that's more than I thought.
Yeah. Writing books on how to write. There's a lot of them. Yep.
Uh,
Lot of us want to write. So
just trying
yeah.
to see here, but yeah, he takes great pains at times to go through things like he talks about the psychology of the conscious mind and the subconscious,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes you sort of raise a little eyebrow and go, "Is this really a correct interpretation of what he's saying?"
Mm-hmm.
But it works for his thought process because. Oh, I got somebody at the door here. So if you want to carry
Okay.
on for a minute, I'll
Sure.
disappear for.
Carrying on.
Uh,
Yeah. So Sean warned us that he'd need to run for a minute. It was possible. So any questions out there? I'd be happy to talk about whatever. Later today, actually, we're going to be talking about the cosmic engineers. So that's coming up. I can just continue with what we were talking about, but the Panshin in SF in Dimension, he talks about mimetic fiction. So mimetic fiction is something that's mirroring life, like any kind of a story that is set in a setting. Like I was reading some of those New York Times things, like in World War II or something like that. So it's a mimicking of real life or historical events or something, or what life is like today or something like that. But he says in here, Panshin says, the purpose of mimetic fiction is consciousness raising. I thought that was an interesting statement. And he says, through inventory, the interconnections of the known are traced. So the known gets to know itself. So Charles Dickens could acquaint you with society, Mark Twain with life on the Mississippi, James Joyce with conscious phrasings of existence of the unconscious. And then he says, the purpose of fantasy is consciousness expansion. And then that's when he starts talking about the existence of unconsciousness and the existence of unknown things in the world around us. And then I thought he had a statement about science fiction too, but he continues to say that science fiction is moving into that fantasy realm. There's a statement about, I don't know, it's like something about, robots and aliens or the spirits of.
oh yeah.
There it is. Modern SF is fantasy. Its magics are various scientific powers that are stronger than any known to existing science. Its spirits and beings are robots and aliens. So he's saying that, modern SF has moved into that area and is pretty squarely in it, according to him.
Yeah, and I like that idea, but it's just that there's certain words that have too much baggage with them to read.
You think they had that baggage back at the time he wrote it?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
I think fantasy would have. Well, maybe not as much because what was there with? Well, there was fantasy, but
Well,
also
you had Tolkien and everybody that
yeah,
influenced Tolkien, but Sword of Shannara, which was really the book that kicked off the epic fantasy subgenre, that was either late 70s or 80s.
70s thing because that was the Del Rey's, right?
So
That was
77,
yeah.
something like that. I can look that up. but that kind of kicked the door open. I remember reading that in high school. Yeah, 77. So I remember reading that in high school. And high school for me would have been what, 82 to 86. Maybe it was junior high because it's like the Elfstones of Shannara would have been book 2, and I think that came out while I was in junior high. So it's a book that was floating around among the readers in
But
school.
also think about this time of these specifically Simak books that we read. He was playing around with
Mm-hmm.
joining together
Yeah,
fantasy elements with
right.
science
So,
fiction, and other writers were too.
mm-hmm.
So I think that's like it's another sort of zeitgeist
Yeah, I
moment
guess.
where
So,
things.
what do you mean by, to me, when the baggage that the word fantasy has in it is Tolkien, elves, dwarves,
Yeah, yeah.
Dungeons and Dragons? That's the baggage that the word has. What do you think? Is it the same for you when you say baggage? What is it? What do you mean?
Yeah, basically, it's like because it's things that are not scientific. Obviously, it's supernatural. That's the
Mm-hmm.
word.
Okay.
It's solely supernatural, and science fiction. And again, science fiction is probably it wasn't a great term to call it because but we were stuck with it in many ways, and it sort of grew out from that term that Hugo Gernsback gave, and it's science based, and even if it's not, it could be super science, like you're saying, science that's beyond our time now, which could be look like magic, like Arthur C. Clarke said, it's something that science is could be viewed as magic or
Mm-hmm.
something.
Mm-hmm.
There's a line,
Yeah.
and but as long as it's using scientific principles, then it's different from pulling out something supernatural
Mm-hmm.
unless you give it scientific principles. So that's the difference between for science fiction and fantasy. But the word fantasy itself means things that aren't real.
Mm-hmm.
So science fiction, these super science things or science that's not here now, is a fantasy.
Yeah.
So in a sense, it
Mm-hmm.
could be fantasy, and then you got science fiction from that, and then you got supernatural or
Mm-hmm.
science fantasy that's based on science, and then another row is fantasy based on supernatural.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
what.
and then when Gernsback coined it, he was like, "This is science, practically
Yeah,
education, right?"
yeah,
Had an educational aspect. So
yeah.
yeah, he
And
was
then
saying,
others
if you
took it
had
in a
someone in
different.
that story running an equation, that would be a good thing.
Yeah, yeah, and but
Yeah.
then others took it in a different way, like Campbell,
Mm-hmm.
shaped it in his view. Like in some ways, I like a better term, which is no longer used anymore: fantastic fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's anything that is basically not mimetic. If you can't look out the window and see it, or things like that, whether it's in the past or even in the future. The future doesn't necessarily mean that it's science fiction, but
Mm-hmm.
if it's everyday people, everything
Yeah,
is like the things are, then
that's
it's not
interesting.
fantastic fiction.
So have you read a story that comes to mind? "Gentlemen Be Seated" by Heinlein. Have you read
I
that? It took place on the moon.
Yeah,
You know, So, I mean, we can see the moon, right?
yeah,
To me, that's a science fiction story, right? Because everything in it is plausible
yeah.
and based on what we know, right? But is it mimetic fiction?
Well, if it's happening, see, that's the thing. If we hadn't gone to the moon yet, then
Which
it's science
we
fiction.
hadn't when he wrote it. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Mm-hmm.
But if you write now something about astronauts and you're writing about exactly what astronauts do and the moon landing in exactly the way it was, now
That's
that's not
mimetic,
science fiction.
right? That's what,
Yeah,
so. So if you write a story like a piece of fiction set during the Apollo program,
yeah,
and it's just I say just but it would be a story of people that worked for NASA, let's say. That's mimetic fiction.
Yeah,
Now,
it's like
if aliens arrive, now we're in fantasy.
yeah, yeah, it's science fiction slash fantasy, but
Right.
it's just like what's his space,
Uh-huh.
uh, James Michener's Space.
Yeah, space, right.
That's not science fiction, but
That's
it's
mimetic, right. Okay. Yeah.
uh,
This is a
got a
good point
couple.
right here. The
Yeah,
word speculative fiction. Oh, yeah. Yeah,
yeah,
Joseph is right. It is part of that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Speculative fiction entered the yeah with to
So
a
that
certain
was,
extent, yeah.
those are all new wave authors right there. Yeah.
Yeah, but it goes right back to also Heinlein wrote an essay which is different about speculative fiction in a book that was published in the 40s, and he wrote
Mm-hmm.
an essay about this that predated these people,
Yeah.
um, and he had a slightly different view of what a speculative fiction was. And
Mm-hmm.
each of those people, Ellison has a different view of what speculative fiction is to a certain extent. Moorcock does. They all have, um, uh, Judith Merrill. They all have different views of what speculative fiction is. So again, it's another term that in one way works, but then in other ways is useless because speculation just means speculating something. So
Mm-hmm.
if you're writing a book and you're speculating on who the next prime minister of Canada is going to be,
Mm-hmm.
that's speculative fiction, but it's still mimetic. So it's not science fiction. It's so it means that every piece of fiction, because it's fiction, it's speculative.
Hmm.
You could define it as that. So
Yeah.
in some ways, it's almost becomes a useless term
Hmm.
unless you define it by things, by
Mm-hmm.
certain elements, and that's where each of them have defined it differently. So
Yeah.
it's just another term that is
Mm-hmm.
just thrown out there, and everybody argues over.
Right. Right. Well, cool.
But
So the next. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just here's the paragraph from James Blish
Okay.
that he quotes, which is did you do you have it there or
I can get it there. Is it in which essay?
it's the new trends and old.
Okay. Let me call that up
It's
here.
about halfway through,
Okay.
or more than halfway. Sorry.
Okay. Flipping through. Oh, there it is. Okay. Yep. Okay, you want me to read it?
Yeah, because I think
Okay.
it's an interesting paragraph.
Okay, so, all right, he says, since at least about 1938, treatment has become steadily more important than springboard notion. Science fiction writers borrow such notions from each other freely, to an extent that in other fields would sometimes be indistinguishable from plagiarism. This is almost never resented, as long as direct quotation is avoided, and the resulting story is commonly welcomed as fresh, if the borrowing writer succeeds in looking at the old idea in a new light, whether that light be dramatic, emotional, or even simply technological. Innovations of this kind, which are far more important in any literary field than any single germinal notion, are what make or break modern science fiction. That's it. Yeah, that was an interesting thing right there.
Yeah,
Um, how interesting, because a lot of the science fiction that is written today is looking back at and again, there's always exceptions, right? But it's like some of the modern science fiction that I've read, let's say in the last 10 years, I read it and I say, oh, well, I've known this from the 50s,
yeah,
and that's often something about science fiction television too, because science fiction television comes out with this new series. It's groundbreaking. People are really excited about it, and I'm like, we were reading this in the '60s. There was, these ideas were being explored in the '60s, but here he's saying that this is what makes or breaks modern science fiction is this borrowing of ideas, and then he says dramatic, emotional, or simply technological new light. That's what a lot of authors are doing right now. Yeah.
yeah. So again, like, he noticed this quite early on, and I think that I'm not sure which essay that's from, one of his Athling essays, or
Yeah,
so that's early.
mhm.
That's in the 50s, I think it would have wrote it.
Yeah. It says here he wrote that. Oh no, it doesn't say when he wrote it. He just
Yeah.
said he began as a writer in 1940. But yeah, it says by 1957 the symbols of SF were complete enough
Right.
to sustain a wide range of imaginary activities. Sorry, I have a cat in front of my screen. Yeah, but he
Well,
is
we we
comfortable.
we mentioned the Reginald Bretner. He had something for cats, and
Hmm.
he translated, I guess, the first book about cats from French, I think.
Really, that's fun. That's cool. So in essay number 8, the very
Uh,
first sentence is
I just
fantasy is plainly an outmoded literature. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's just, there was a comment, it just popped up by
Yeah,
Joseph. The concept of tractor beam was around in the 19th.
yeah,
Yeah, Star Wars. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. That's true. There's so many things that like laser guns that just become part of the tool set.
Well, as we've just read, and we'll be talking later today about
Hmm.
cosmic engineers, and there's stuff in there that is it. There are some Star Trek sort of elements that show up in there to a
Sure
certain,
enough.
you
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
and you mentioned, well, we'll re-mention it about Stephen King.
Hmm.
He clearly read Simak, because this is the
Yeah, and
second.
he admitted that he did.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. How interesting. That makes Harlan Ellison look kind of silly, doesn't it? I mean, how many times has he sued over one of these ideas?
Yeah.
Like Terminator, he claimed was his from, was it an Outer Limits episode? Was it Outer
Oh yeah,
Limits?
yeah, yeah.
I can't
And
remember which one.
A. Van
It's
Vogt
called The Soldier or something like that.
got a big payout, sort of out of court,
Mm-hmm.
for Alien, because it was, the I always forget the name of the bloody story, and it started
Uh-huh.
with
Is it Black
uh,
Destroyer?
Black Destroyer. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Wild. Yeah. So right, so in essay 8 again, the very first line is fantasy is plainly an outmoded literature.
Yeah.
He writes this in 1974, a year after the previous one.
But it's interesting when he goes on, because right away you'll
Uh-huh.
get people going, "What?" Read the rest of the paragraph, and then
Yeah.
read the short little essay, and
Yep.
it's
It's good
clickbait
stuff.
before clickbait.
Yep, absolutely. Clickbait. Yep. That's good stuff. He says science fiction, at least, may pretend to have relevance to our future and so capture our attention. Fantasy speaks only of a yesterday that is nowhere to be found in all our atlases and histories. And then he starts to go, what is the difference between science fiction and fantasy? And the question, he says, perhaps the question we ought to be asking is why fantasy should survive at all in our times. And then he starts to go into fantasy endures in our time in spite of its anachronistic, superficial trappings because it has a special character that human beings need and seek, which cannot be found in any other contemporary fiction. I agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then that's where I love this so short an essay, because he drops a bomb at the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
and then he's saying, well, this, like, he asks the question and he answers it, or to his answer saying, no, it is relevant still, even
Yeah.
though
Yeah.
it doesn't work. Like, you can no longer talk about the the interior of Africa in a certain way, or something like that, or have
Mm-hmm.
dinosaurs, on a plateau in South America,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
Right.
Um, you know, but
Yeah.
it's
It's an interesting thing to think about too. When you look at mythology through history, um, and also, I am a believing Christian, so there's Christianity as well. the Bible. So the Bible in the Western world was the common literature. It's what everybody knew. And when you read authors of all types throughout history writing fiction, um, they're referring to Bible stories, whether overtly or just under the surface. It was like a common thing that we all knew, we all shared, right, in the Western world, right? And nowadays, that's becoming less true by the day. And if I had to point to what, at least in the United States, what the common literature of the day is, meaning that you can say something about something and everyone would know what you're talking about, is got to be movies.
Yeah.
And it's probably, like I've said, Marvel. Let's say Marvel, right? 20 Marvel movies, this mythology but there's just something about the mythological stories that are deeper and resonate deeper, Anyway, that's a conversation I've had before, but it's like there's just something about that strikes a chord. And that, I've been really enjoying reading some old fantasy lately. That I think I mentioned it, but it might have been our last one. That Ballantine adult fantasy series by Lynn Carter was the editor of those, and things like King of Elfland's Daughter, The Blue Star by Fletcher Pratt, The Broken Sword by Poul Anderson. If you look that up in, there's a nice Wikipedia entry that lists all the books that are in this series, but they're all old. They weren't all written in the 40s. These are all things that would have influenced Tolkien. Things like Beowulf. I'm really getting into that stuff. I really, really like it. There's just something about it.
It's interesting you mentioned like the movies thing, and like when people mention the Avengers, they think of one, and it's like and then I always say it to me. It's like, oh, John Steed and Mrs. Peel,
right? Yeah.
They look a little different in this movie.
Absolutely.
Libera Paradiso.
Oh, it sure has.
Yeah,
I
that's
agree.
Something.
Yeah.
I think it's got to be within the last year. I just first heard the term romantasy.
Yeah.
And I go, well, what the hell's that? And
yeah.
it's like,
it's so many of them being written that it's just become a category. But yeah, on that New York Times list that I was reading, the number 1 and number 3 were romantasy. Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, they say that. What is the name of it? Onyx? Onyx Storm by Rebecca Yarros. I was reading an article the other day that said that was the fastest selling book of all time.
Really?
Yeah, it was breaking records for how many it was selling in a short period. So a lot of people like it
for author, but
yeah.
I was just looking at the second to last paragraph of this little one. What is this here? Moreover, in science fiction stories, all acts are not yet perceived to be morally significant. In fantasy, magic is clearly white or black, moral or immoral. In science fiction, the science beyond science, the contemporary equivalent of magic, is not so clearly defined. So it's kind of interesting. Like on the one hand, he's saying that science fiction is fantasy, but then he starts talking about the differences.
Yeah. How interesting. So, The Cold Equations by Tom Godwin, in which we're presented with these facts, and there's no getting around the facts of the universe, the physics of the universe, right? And
it's not good or bad.
It's not good or bad. It just is. This is how it is, right?
But
as
magic,
opposed to, all of your acts are significant. So, I don't know. That's almost like a nihilism versus anything else.
Yeah, well, and also too, it's different to magic. Magic can be wielded, but then again, science can be wielded for good or bad. But the science itself isn't. Well, I suppose you could say the same about magic. magic is not good or bad. It is, and it's the people who wield it. So he doesn't talk about that, but I just thought of that because there is similarities there.
Yeah, and there are, I can point to some things where the magic is actually evil,
The magic
the
itself.
magic itself, right?
Oh, okay.
So you've got people like Brandon Sanderson who have magic systems, that are practically physical laws, So in that case, what you do and what you don't, what you do with it is the good or evil, right? Just like in the regular world. And then, but heck, James Blish wrote like Black Easter, and he wrote 3 books called After Such Knowledge. He kind of grouped them together. They're loosely grouped. I'm trying to remember the names of the other ones. But The Day After Judgment was one. But anyway, in there, there are things that are just evil, that magic, that you can summon demons and things like that, right? There's no other use for the magic, so the magic itself is evil.
Okay, yeah.
So
yeah,
I'm just saying, and there are numerous stories in which, just from throughout history, mythology or legends and folklore,
So, but you don't really get that with science, like it's
Yeah, and I wonder if it's actually kind of a recent development that, and I could be totally wrong. I would love people's comments because I'm thinking on the fly here, but if it's a recent development that a magic system could actually be, just like physical laws where, the wielder decides the good and the evil of it.
Yeah, because
that could be really recent. Yeah.
Yeah. The thing is that I lost my train of thought. It was something to do with the thing of trying to take magic and make a scientific basis for it.
Mm-hmm.
Then to me, it's no longer magic. Like it's no longer magic. It's something else because magic has to be, to me, supernatural. And if you do have, scientific gadgets to create it, then it's no longer it's no longer supernatural.
Right. Yeah.
So, but it's an interesting way to do it.
And I haven't read enough Brandon Sanderson to be able to say what he's doing, but he's famous for the magic system creation. He creates these rules and then writing stories within that universe. They called it hard fantasy in a panel I've watched before. Hard fantasy meaning, I'm creating these physical laws and all my characters have to abide by them. So it's not magic in a way anything can happen.
So is that still supernatural or is it not? Yeah, it's natural law.
It would be natural, yeah. It would be natural law. And then something like Harry Potter.
Yeah.
In Harry Potter, anything can happen, right?
Yeah.
Which is a tragic flaw to the story in the first place. It's like, well, couldn't he have just used magic to solve this issue? You know what I mean?
Something's happening to my camera here or something. I've got flipping lines or something.
I can barely notice it here, but there's a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah. Barely noticeable on my end.
Okay. It's quite bad on mine, so it's been
okay.
So I do apologize for everybody if it does show up bad on the recording. And then we got the last one here, number 9, fantasy. Again from the magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, March '74.
Oh gosh, I'm chuckling because the first line,
he
uses the word speculative fantasy.
But also too he uses, but he also uses the term that you say you never use. Once upon a time.
Oh, I love it. Oh, this is just fun. Yeah. Really great.
But this again is more reviews of things, and he talks about a book that I've been trying to get, the Marjorie M. Miller's checklist of works published in the United States of Isaac Asimov, 39 to 72. And I've seen it at various times for very cheap, and then I've seen it for huge amount of prices. I know
Yeah.
it's out of date, but that's the period, or at least this early stuff that I'd
Hmm.
like to have, even if it's checklist. But I don't want to pay much for it.
Yeah.
Uh,
That's fun.
uh,
So here he's talking about fandom,
yes,
and he says SF conventions have now reached an unwieldy size. There is a loss of the old happy intimacy. Gosh, it's funny how things come around. You know, it's yeah, they're big. Worldcons are huge.
yeah, and he talks about that, in one essay, maybe not in this set, but that there was up to 4,000 at one convention, and I'm going,
Yeah.
yeah, that's small now, I think, for
Oh my
some.
gosh. Yeah. Oh, that's fun.
But there's interesting things here. Like, yeah, he just goes through um, a bunch of books and just talks about it. I mean, he talks about a
Mhm.
Ursula K. Le Guin little pamphlet. It's stapled, called "From Elfland to Poughkeepsie" by Ursula
Mhm.
K. Le Guin, and he says it's $3 for 30-page pamphlet, $5 for a signed copy.
Oh my gosh.
A
Yeah.
signed copy now is over 400 in really good shape. Okay.
Mhm.
And then the magazine science fiction checklist, which has been superseded, but it doesn't talk about that so much. But
Mhm.
the world of fanzines, a form of communication by Frederick Wortham, MD. It's very short. It's under 100 pages, but again, it's over like 100 and some dollars or pounds. I've got a copy, but I didn't pay that for it.
Mhm. Yeah. Wow. That's amazing.
And then he talks about Reginald Bretner, who did the modern science fiction, its meaning, its future. I think that's
Mhm.
the 1953 one, and then reissued by Advent
Mhm.
later. And then he wrote two others where this. I've got one of the others. I should have brought it down.
Yeah.
Uh, and then he spends a long time picking apart Brian Aldiss's Billion Year
Billion
Spree,
Year Spree. Yeah.
which he says he shouldn't do because he's writing his own about this. But he just says, "What the hey? I'm gonna do it
Just,
anyway."
yeah, he goes after it. So Billion Year Spree was rewritten and became Trillion Year Spree, right?
Yeah, by somebody else. I think
Oh,
did most of the work for it.
oh, I didn't know that. I thought it was all of
Yeah.
us who did it, but you're saying no, huh?
Well, he had input, but I don't know how much input, to be
Okay.
honest. Yeah, because there was somebody else that sort of fluffed it out, and it's mostly, I think I can't remember now. I think they mostly expanded the 20th century stuff because
Hmm.
the criticisms that the pensions have for it are very apt, because he just mentions stuff. It's
Uh
like a
huh.
checklist. He doesn't talk about the stories. He doesn't talk about the authors much.
Oh,
Occasionally he does,
okay.
but
Hmm.
it's the earlier stuff, the pre 1900 stuff, which to me was the most interesting in
Yeah.
the billion year spree.
Hmm.
And then I'm pretty sure he expands it, or they expand it in
Yeah.
the trillion.
Great.
Uh,
Well, cool. Yeah.
but
Anyway, yeah, these essays are fun again.
yeah, and
Yep.
then the next section is a big one. There's only three essays. It's on Heinlein. They're all on Heinlein.
Okay, yeah, that's
So
great.
yeah,
But
so
it's only 3 essays, but it's 100 pages,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
I'm looking forward to that very much. Yeah.
Yeah, like the first one, I've already read the first one and talked briefly about it in our last Heinlein
Mm-hmm.
book video, and it's interesting because he quotes some really interesting stuff. But again, he gets into the not psychological, but yeah, I guess psychological, emotional,
Mm-hmm.
sociological argument that, again, it seems a little tenuous, but if you just go along with it, then you can see where he's making his points. But
Yeah.
he's trying
Yeah.
to use a datum, I think, something to that everybody hopefully can understand themselves, to make a comparison to.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, because it's Heinlein, and our next book for the Heinlein reading is the Star Beast. It's juvenile, but
Hmm.
we'll reconvene. Myself and Scott will reconvene on that day, which should be the 15th.
The 15th, yeah.
Yeah, and we'll discuss the Heinlein essays, and then later we'll talk about the Star Beast.
Right.
And there's one essay that he uh, Panshin quotes from Rottensteiner, an Australian critic, and I think he might have wrote some science fiction as well,
Hmm.
which is really damning. It's really harsh against Heinlein, super harsh. So I've tracked down that essay, so I'm going to read that, but then talk about that in the
Cool.
the Heinlein bit.
Fantastic.
But
Looking forward to it. Yeah.
yeah, these are really good.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. And I'm almost like I was thinking, because, like I say, this is a build up to I think the World Beyond the Hill.
Hmm.
So I don't know if it's something that we should maybe other people watching would they prefer us to go on to something else after this, or go directly to maybe the World Beyond the Hill
Yeah, we sure can.
as the back to back.
Yeah.
But there's so many. There's so many because there's essay. I love essays to begin with.
Hmm. Me
And
too. Me too.
essays in science fiction are really good because they'll encapsulate a little idea, and it's like I can't. Every time I read one of the Panshin's essays, I don't know where my mind is going. Like, it's just all over the place because there's so many thought processes that he has got into it, and then my mind goes into these other areas too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love it. I love it. And it's funny to see him contradict himself, and
Yeah.
it's fun to see him just explore, and them,
Yeah.
Alexei and Cory. So, yeah, really enjoying this a ton. So, thanks for the suggestion. Yeah, thanks, Joseph.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I like, yeah, it's just I don't know how we got on to do that. I guess it was just the
Well, I think we started because I had a copy of Pohl's biography,
oh yeah,
and you had that, and said, well, if you're going to read it, let's read it together. So we did. And then that has led to the Futurians, and now has led to Panshin, and I have a feeling it's going to lead to a lot more. So
yeah. Well, you still got the Futurian, so maybe
Yeah.
we'll pause this and then do the Futurian. Well,
Whatever.
let's see
I'm
what-
happy to go to World Beyond the Hill. So
Yeah,
yep.
yeah. I think
enjoying all of it.
I'm more than happy to reread that. I've read it
Yeah.
twice in the past, but it's
Mhm.
got to be almost 20 years since I've read The World
That's
Beyond
cool.
the Hill.
Yeah, love it.
So, and then I guess after that, should we read the Billion Years Period and then Trillion? Yeah, we could go forever because there's
Yes, we
so
can.
much good stuff.
So much. Yeah, we'll see where the next one takes us.
Again, everybody, thanks, and
thank
put
you.
your comments down if you have any thoughts on this, or things that you know, if you'd like to see us continue after this with for the World Beyond the Hill, keep it with the Panshins, or go some other direction.
Very
I'd
cool.
love to hear from you.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, all.